We ended up with the Red Sea as they were going through, and we're just going to go from the Red Sea. They traveled, the book of Exodus was a movement from Egypt to Sinai. So it's Red Sea, Mount Sinai. Now at Mount Sinai, there's several things that they received. The first was the law. And so we've talked about that already, the circumstances surrounding the law and the 10 Commandments and the 613 laws. But they also received information about the tabernacle. And so I don't know if you remember that little ditty things, here's the church. No, like this, now I think they went no, it was like this. So here's the church. And here's the steeple. I don't know, was it like this, Russell? The steeple here or back here? Here's the steeple. And then you'd take your little fingers and my mom would open them up. And if you go inside, it's all the people. So that was the church. And so I'm going to use that, but it's not a church for the Jews. It was the tabernacle. So at Mount Sinai, they received the law, but they also received all of the information. Remember the details of how big and what they're to make it out of, and all that information about the tabernacle. Now, what we're going to be covering today, it has to do with the inside of the tabernacle, are not people that go into the tabernacle. It's the Levites and priests that go into the tabernacle. So it's going to be Mount Sinai, the law, the tabernacle, Levites and priests. And then today we're going to be talking about, in the book of Leviticus, two different parts. They're still at Mount Sinai. The information that they received was the offerings, if you're going to make an offering to God, the offerings and the feasts. So that's going to be one, offerings and feasts. So it's Red Sea, Mount Sinai, the law, the tabernacle, the Levites and priests, the offerings and feasts. Let's try it from the beginning. Creation. Creation.
All. Flood. Nations. 4,000 years. Persian Gulf. Salt. Sarah. Abraham. Lot.
Terah.
Tigris. Aaron. Sea of Galilee. Jordan River. Dead Sea. Mediterranean Sea. Israel. Ishmael. Isaac. Esau. Jacob. Joseph. Egypt. Jews. Egypt.
How long were they there?
400 years. Bondage. Moses. Let my people go. No. 10 plagues. Red Sea.
Can you get them? Mount Sinai, law, tabernacle, Levites and priests, offerings and feasts. Offerings and feasts. Very good. So, we're going to start talking about your favorite book in the Bible, the book of Leviticus. It's probably the one that you started reading as a little boy and a little girl and memorized everything that was in the book of Leviticus. Is that right?
I love Leviticus.
Yeah, it's one of Maggie's favorite books as well. But for the Jewish child, that would have been the exact situation. The book of Leviticus would have been one of the first books that as a little Jewish boy or little Jewish girl that you would have studied. And yet as Christians, it's often the last book that we study. However, this book is mentioned 40 times in the New Testament. For the Jews, it was a significant aspect of their everyday life. There's extensive information in this book about the character of God. And the main emphasis of the book is God's holiness, his absolute holiness. It gives us also information about how people are to live a holy life. Basically, it's the idea that man has sin in his life. The Jews had sin, and so how are they to relate to an absolute holy and righteous God? How can the Jews who are full of sin be in right relationship to God? And that's what the book is going to be about. Now, in the book, we see that basically that the nation is going to start worshiping God. And that's what this book is about, how to live in relationship to God. The title of the book, Leviticus, as with most or many of these books, the Hebrew Bible, the original title of the book when it was written, when Moses wrote it down, it was not Leviticus. That did not come until the Latin Vulgate. And so it was much later where the title of the book became Leviticus. Before, just like the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus, it's the first word in the Hebrew text became the title for the book. And it's the idea that God called. It's like God is the one who is calling his people. Now, the Latin Vulgate used the equivalent of the word Leviticus, and they got that from a Greek word which means Levi. And even in the English today, you can see that. Leviticus, Levi. And so that next slide shows you that Greek word for the Levitical priests and the word for Levi. You can see those two together. So the name of the book came, the Latin Vulgate took this Greek word, and that's where they came up with the title for the book, Leviticus. And it's found in Hebrews chapter 7. If perfection could have been attained through the Levitical, that's the word, priesthood, why was there still need for another priest to come? And so the Latin Vulgate took that word, and then they would have written it in Latin. So that's where the title came from. The author, as normal, was not J.E.P.D., but was Moses. I want to look at just 2 verses to indicate that Moses was involved with this message, and then we'll look at one New Testament verse. And Leviticus 7, 37 and 38.
This is the law of the burnt offering, the grain offering, and the sin offering, and the guilt offering, and the ordination offering, and the sacrifice of peace offerings, which the Lord commanded Moses at Mount Sinai in the day that he commanded the sons of Israel to present their offerings to the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai.
So God gave these commands to Moses. And so it would be likely that he was the one that wrote them down, communicated them to the people. We can see it very similarly, Tim, in chapter 26 and verse 46. Leviticus 26 and verse 46.
These are the statutes and ordinances and laws which the Lord established between himself and the sons of Israel through Moses.
Okay, so Moses was the one through whom these laws were established. And so, though I would say these are not clear indications that Moses wrote these down, but it was clearly he was the one that God shared them with, and thus likely he would have been the one that wrote them down. However, the clincher to me is the next verse, which is found in Matthew chapter 8. And again, Jesus, so both internally there's indications that Moses was the author, but then Jesus gives credit to these verses in Leviticus 14 to Moses, chapter 8 and verse 4.
And Jesus said to him, "See that you tell no one, but go, show yourself to the priest, and present the offering that Moses commanded as a testimony to them."
Who commanded it? I mean, it was God's command, but Moses was the one that Jesus is saying that commanded this. We see it in Leviticus. He took Leviticus, said that was Moses that commanded that. And so he would have been the one who wrote it down. Historically, the book has basically no movement, physical movement. At the book of Exodus, the movement went, as you remember, in the point 2 of the outline, they moved from Egypt to Mount Sinai. But in the book of Leviticus, there's no physical movement. They're not going to travel any place. But Leviticus is the sequel. It is historically in movement. This would have been the next event. They moved to Mount Sinai. They received the law, and part of that law would have been this book of Leviticus. And so the book will show the walk, the way that Israel is to live, how they are to maintain a relationship with God. How can a sinful nation, a sinful people, have a relationship with a holy God? That's the point of the book. I don't usually give you a key verse, but Leviticus 19 and verse 2, I wrote it down here. It says, "Speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them," this is the point of the book, "Be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy." In order to have a relationship with an absolute holy God, man must be holy. Must be. What does that word mean, holy?
Separate.
Put it in a sentence. Explain that. What does it mean that the Israelites are to be holy?
They are to be a separate nation.
What's that mean? What would that look like, to be a separate nation? You're taking the exact translation of the word holy. It means to be separate. But I'm asking, practically speaking, they are to be holy. Well, we say be separate, yes, but what's that mean?
Consecrated to the Lord. Everything is theocratic or theo-oriented. God.
Okay, good. Bob, you were gonna. I saw your lips just about moving.
I would think that it would mean making every attempt to live like God
Very
desired
good.
that we live, which would separate us from the average
Yes.
ordinary person.
Very good.
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah. You know, sometimes we.
I was reading in mind, Peter.
Great minds think alike.
Yeah. Holiness must be maintained before God, and holiness can only be maintained through a proper atonement for sin. Let's turn to Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 1. Let's see, I think it's Bob there too, and you, Hebrews 10 and verse 1.
The law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. For this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifices, repeated endless years after years, make perfect those who draw near to worship.
So tell me what that verse is saying. What are some of the different aspects of that verse?
The keeping the law, first of all, requires annual cleansing or annual purification, atonement. And by sacrificing your sacrifices will just never make you. That's not the perfect sacrifice.
What's it mean? It's only a shadow.
It's a type.
Put it in a sentence. Say what that is. I mean,
It's a shadow or type is a type is something that it's pointing to something else. It's prefiguring something else.
what's a literal shadow?
Absence of light.
It's reflection.
Okay,
Reflection of an image.
a reflection of an image. So in what way is the law? It says here, the law has but a shadow of the good things to come.
Not the real thing.
Okay, it's not the real thing.
You can't quite see it.
But the shape is there. So there are going to be many similarities with the real thing. But the good things of the law are only a shadow. And basically, who is the real thing? Jesus Christ. You see, these sacrificial things in the Old Testament and all of these laws and all of these things that we're going to see in Leviticus are but a shadow. And the one that's reflecting that shadow is Jesus Christ. And so these sacrifices, and they're going to be laying out all of these sacrifices, the Day of Atonement and all of these things, cannot make perfect those who draw near. They're offered year after year, continually offered, but it can never, it says, make perfect those who draw near. Now turn to 1 Timothy chapter 6. Back to the left. Is there a left? 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 16. Russell? First Timothy 6 and verse 16, please. Maybe why don't you read 15 also? It's still one of Paul's long sentences, but we'll get 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 15 and 16.
Which he will bring about at the proper time, he who is the blessed and the only sovereign, the King of kings, the Lord of hosts, who alone possesses immortality and dwells in an unapproachable light, who no man can see or can see. To him to be honor and eternal domain. Amen.
Okay, so look at verse 16, and again, tell me what's that saying.
That you can't see him?
Who's it talking about, actually?
Christ.
Correct.
Yeah. So, what's it mean we can't see him? People saw him. You're right. But what's it mean that you can't see him?
Because he's not mortal.
Okay.
He's immortal. And we can see mortal?
Too bright.
Okay. Too bright.
Oh.
What's it mean he's unapproachable?
He's too holy.
Yeah, he's too holy. And God is often related to a light. And so if you can imagine trying to get closer and closer to the sun, to the, the S-U-N, the brightness of the sun, and as you get closer and closer to the sun, what's going to happen to you as a mortal man? You're going to get burned up. And so that's how it's kind of relating Jesus here. Verse 14, it identifies him as Jesus, the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. So he possesses immortality, but the point that I wanted to make was that he dwells in unapproachable light. See, man as a sinful being is not able to approach God in all of his glory. And Leviticus is talking about how that sinful man can approach the unapproachable and not be burned up. That's what the book of Leviticus is about. And that's why it was so significant for the Jewish follower. The atonement of the blood of a lamb is only a shadow of the atonement of Jesus Christ. Key word for the book. I want you to look at that picture, and you see the priest who's balancing on his right foot. And so the other man gives his left foot a kiss. So it's left foot a kiss. So the book of Leviticus,
That's really bad. It's, you've been pushing it before.
You know what, I am scarred for life right now. I will never see Leviticus with
so the book of Leviticus, as he's balancing, there's two things there that he's balancing, and they represent the two parts of the book. And the one thing that he's balancing are the offerings, and we're going to be studying those today. And the other thing that he's balancing are the feasts, and that will be next week, that we'll look at the last part of the book. So we're going to look at the offerings today, and then next week we'll look at the feasts. But the book can be thought of in those two things, as he's balancing on his right foot and getting his left foot a kiss. He's holding those two things, the offerings and feasts. I thought you guys would like that.
Very creative.
Okay, the theme of the book. God is going to explain to the Israelites how they're to worship in the temple and how they are to live a holy life outside of the temple. So it has to do with their offerings and, in the temple, how they are to go about those offerings. But then we'll talk also about the holy life, how they are to live differently than the world around them. The things they eat are to be different from the world around them. How they conduct their daily life is to be different. This whole thing of clean and unclean, we'll see, has to do with this holiness of daily life. The word holiness is used 87 times in the book. And so that's why it's seen as part of the major theme of the book. The outline, today we're going to cover the first 5 offerings and the Levitical priesthood, and then basically the holiness and daily life. The middle of the book has to do with the Day of Atonement and how they are to live, and then the feasts. So if you can see, the beginning of the book has to do with the offerings, and towards the end of the book it has to do with the feasts, which we'll cover next week, and then fellowship. Any questions besides putting down my left foot a kiss? Okay, I'm going to try something, and we'll see if I can get this thing to work.
Leviticus. We know you've been avoiding it because it's weird. So let's fix that. Now remember, the story of the Bible began with humans in God's presence, but they were banished because of their rebellion. However, God wants to be in relationship with us, so he chooses one family that he will use to restore the world back into his presence.
And so God's presence comes to dwell in a tent right in the middle of Israel.
And that's great.
But it creates a problem, because it's so intense that Moses can't go in, and other priests who enter inappropriately, they die.
Well, wait, if God's presence is good, how is it all of a sudden dangerous for people?
So think of it this way. God's presence is like the sun. It's pure power and goodness. And when something mortal and corruptible gets close to such pure power, it's destroyed. And so the word holiness is used in Leviticus to describe God's pure and powerful presence, which, like the sun, is both good and dangerous. So the point of Leviticus is to show how corrupt Israelites can live near God's goodness without being destroyed. Now, in the book, there are 3 ways for how this is all going to work out, and these are going to seem strange to you, but just hang in there with us.
The first one is rituals. The second is this idea of the priesthood, and the third is a bunch of purity laws.
Now, the book is broken up into 7 sections, and each solution is explored in 2 sections of the book. The rituals are here, the priests are here, and the purity laws go here.
Now, the first solution, rituals, involves a lot of animal sacrifices. And so Leviticus begins with detailed instructions for how to make these sacrifices. Some are ways of saying thank you to God, and others are simply ways of saying, I'm sorry.
And here, at the end of the book, there are some more rituals. These are about observing sacred days and festivals. They're all celebrations that retell some part of the story of how God rescued Israel and set them apart from the nations.
The second solution to the holiness problem has to do with priests. You see, being directly in God's presence is really dangerous. So he appoints priests as special representatives who can go into his presence on behalf of others.
So in this section, we have a story about how the priests are ordained into the priesthood. And then this other section explains the set of higher standards that the priests have to live by because they work so closely to God's presence.
The third solution in the book is all about purity laws. And this is by far the hardest thing to understand. For example, in this section, we're really concerned with knowing whether you're clean or unclean.
Or another way of saying that is being pure and impure. And here's what we need to know to understand this. When you're in a pure state, you can be near God's presence. When you're in an impure state, you can't. And so it was really important for Israelites to know what state they're in at any given moment.
So the first thing we have is a list of pure and impure animals.
Yeah, this list of animals is divided up by where they live, so on the land, in the sea, in the air. And the text is just not clear about why certain animals are impure or why touching or eating them makes you impure. What is clear, however, is that avoiding these creatures will set Israel apart, and it will remind them that God's own holiness should affect every part of their lives, including what they eat.
After the food laws, we get a lot of random rules about things like skin disease, touching dead bodies, what to do with bodily fluids.
But they're not random. All of these are things that the Israelites associated with life and death, which are sacred things because God is the author of life.
Okay, but simply coming into contact with these things makes you impure?
They do, but we have to keep in mind that it's not wrong or sinful to be ritually impure. You just wait a few days, take a bath, offer sacrifice, and you're pure again. What is inappropriate is entering into God's presence when you're in an impure state.
Now, there's more purity laws over here in this section.
Yeah, these focus on Israel's moral behavior. So these are laws about social justice, healthy relationships, having sexual integrity. Living by these laws will make Israel into a morally pure people who can live near God's presence.
Those are the three solutions. Now, you probably noticed that they surround the very center of this book. And it's here that we find a really important ritual called the Day of Atonement.
Yeah, so Israel's a big tribe now, and odds are there's a lot of sin happening that goes unnoticed, that people are not dealing with. And so one time a year, the priests would take 2 goats, and one of those goats is killed, and its blood is carried right into God's presence where it symbolically covers or atones for Israel's sin.
Yeah, that's kind of weird.
Well, the meaning of the sacrifice is explained in the next chapter, where God says that the blood of a creature is its life. And so this goat's life is offered as a substitute. It's receiving God's punishment for Israel's sin so that the people don't have to.
That leaves the second goat.
Yeah, the priest puts his hands on it, and then he confesses all of the sins of Israel. It's like he's placing the sins on the goat. And then that goat gets cast out forever into the wilderness. It's called the scapegoat.
Yeah, I've heard that word before.
Yeah, it's this very powerful image of how God is graciously removing Israel's sin.
But let's be honest, sacrifices in general seem so barbaric.
We have to remember that in the ancient world, sacrifices were the main way of buying favor from the gods. But the problem was that those same gods, they're unpredictable, they're fickle, you never know if they're going to ignore you or they're going to turn on you. And so it's in this cultural setting that we see Israel's God as totally different. He does get angry about human corruption, but it is never arbitrary. And he loves people. So he provides this clear way for Israel to know with confidence that they are forgiven and that despite their corruption, they are safe to live near his presence. And so that makes the book of Leviticus actually a revolutionary statement in its day.
So that's Leviticus. But Israel's still at Mount Sinai in the middle of the wilderness. They need a place to live.
Yes, the land God promised to Abraham. And so the journey to that land is what the next book of the Bible is all about. Hi, this is Tim.
And this is John.
We believe the Bible is telling.
Okay. I thought that was an excellent kind of overview of the book. And so I hope it kind of gives you a flavor of that structure. And it's called how do you pronounce that? Chiastic? A chiastic structure of the book. And in English, we have some of those chiastic kinds of statements as well. It's a literary device in which you take a certain set of ideas, and then you kind of reflect those ideas in the opposite order. And so I tried to draw a picture of that, of how you've got 3 different topics, and then you repeat those 3 topics, but in the opposite order. So if you had topic A, and then topic B, and then topic C, the chiastic structure is to repeat those topics, but in the opposite order. Instead of starting with A, it will go again with C, then topic B, and then topic A. And so we see that chiastic structure in the book. In English, some of the sayings, when the going gets tough. Now, going gets tough, then it repeats it, tough, get going. You see that backwards? That's called chiastic. It comes from the Greek letter chi, which is an X. And so, as also Benjamin Franklin, by failing to prepare, you prepare to fail. It's a chiastic structure that we use, and it's just a literary device. And the book of Leviticus is structured with that device, that chiastic structure. So we see topic A at the very beginning of the book in chapters 1 through 7, and we see topic A in verses 23 to 27. So it's at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book. And with the priesthood, chapters 8 through 10, and it's also in chapter 21 to 22. It talks of the priesthood. And then the purity laws, 11 to 15, and also 18 to 20. And so the middle, it kind of points to, kind of builds and emphasizes that middle section, which was a very important day called the Day of Atonement. And we'll be covering all of this and things later. So, we're going to start Leviticus chapter 1. That was my little introduction to the book. Left-footicus. I'm going to cover basically chapters 1 through 7. I'm going to pretty much do it with a chart and then a little illustration. And I'm going to give you the illustration first. We're going to be talking about the offerings. And there are 5 different offerings. We'll go through that little chart that I gave you, the little half sheet of paper, in a little bit. But I just want you to listen to this as kind of like this little story. And I gave you the full written out version of the story so that you can have it to review. So I want you to imagine a Jew. There's an Israelite worshiper, and he's going to come to his priest. And this is why he's coming. He has stolen one of his neighbor's sheep. Now, after he stole that little lamb, he returned the animal to the owner. But now he feels this need of forgiveness from God. So he goes to the priest and he asks, Mr. Priest, what do I need to do? I sinned. I stole this little lamb from my neighbor. I gave it back to him. But, this feeling that I have, this need for being forgiven to God, what do I need to do? And so the priest explains that because of this offense, that he needs to bring to God a guilt offering. Now, we'll cover later what that guilt offering is. But at this point, he has sinned, and what he needs to do is to bring a guilt offering. So he does that, and he feels much better, so he goes home. But, the next day, he goes back to the priest again. And this time, his conscience, he's just burdened kind of in his conscience. He knows that God has forgiven him for the thievery, but he just feels like, I'm a sinner. I just struggle with sin in my life. He hasn't committed a particular sin, but just that recognition that I am a sinner. So he goes to the priest and says, What do I need to do? And so the priest he instructs him to bring a sin offering. Now again, we'll cover that in a little bit. So he does that. He brings the sin offering to the tabernacle, and he goes home and feels much better. Now the next day he goes back again to the priest, and he explains that not only has he received a pardon, and not only has he felt better because of this sin offering, but he just feels like he's distant from God. It's kind of like he's out of fellowship with God. He's out of fellowship with his fellow man, and so what is he supposed to do? And so he's to bring, sometimes it's called a peace offering or a fellowship offering. It's not because of sin that he's bringing this offering. It's an offering of sweet aroma to God. And it can be fellowship between him and God, or fellowship between one Israelite and another. The next day, the man goes back again. And this time he's just so thankful for all that God has done for him. He's forgiven him. His conscience, the weight of being a sinner, is much has been lifted. He feels in close fellowship with God. He's in close fellowship with his fellow man. And what should I do, Mr. Priest? Well, bring a grain offering. A grain offering was an offering of thanksgiving, not because of sin, but just in praise to God. Well, he's going to go back one more time the next day to the priest. And this fifth and last time that he visits the priest, he wants to ask the question, I'm so thankful to God. I just want to give my whole life to him. I want to yield my whole life to him. What do I need to do? And so he does this burnt offering. Finally, it's an act of utter devotion to the will of God, and that idea of surrendering 100%, being sold out to God, that God owns him. So those are the various different offerings in a context to help you to feel what they are. Take a look at your little chart. There are 5 offerings. The burnt, grain, fellowship, sin, and guilt offering. And the second line tells you what could be offered as a burnt offering. They could bring a bull, they could bring a male sheep or goat, a dove or a pigeon, and so forth. The object that they are going to offer. But the point that I want to do is this third line here, the occasion of the offering. When is the offering going to be made? And basically, if we start at the end, that guilt offering had to do with the denial of the rightful due to God, that I have sinned and disobeyed him, I have not followed him, and thus this guilt offering. I'll talk about it later when we actually go through the text. Then the sin offering, we're going backwards, is for an unintentional sin. It's not that I stole my neighbor's sheep. That's what we would tend to think of as a sin offering, but it's more the idea that I'm a sinner and I feel the weight of my sinfulness. It's not a particular sin that I have committed. That would be a guilt offering. The fellowship offering is just an offering of thanks to God. It's a thank offering, but it has to do with the fellowship either between man and God or between one man and another. It's also, in some places, some versions call it a peace offering. The grain offering is just an offering of thanksgiving, of praise to God. And the burnt offering is just an act of worship, of dedication to God. Then to me it's also interesting, you can look at that typology at the end and how each one of these offerings are involved with that. So anyway, just to Any questions? We'll go through each one of these offerings here and look at the verse in Leviticus. Chapters 1 through 6.
I'm glad you did this, because as I was reading, I felt like I needed to do this.
Yeah.
But I didn't, so.
Okay, the burnt offering. The purpose of the burnt offering was for general atonement for sin and the expression of devotion to God. The instructions for the burnt offering are given in chapter 1, verses 3 through 17. I want to just read chapter 1, verses 3 through 6. I think it's Marlene. Leviticus chapter 1, verses 3 through 6.
If the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he is to offer a male without defect. He must present it at the entrance of the tent of meeting, so that it will be
Accepted, maybe? I don't know.
acceptable
Oh,
to the Lord. He is to lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be acceptable on his behalf, to make an atonement for him. He is to slaughter the young bull before the Lord, and then Aaron's sons and priests shall bring the blood and sprinkle it against the altar on all sides at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He is to skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces.
good. Thank you. The offering in verse 3, it could be a bull. In verse 10, it could be a sheep, a lamb, or it could be a goat. And then in verse 14, that offering could be a dove or a pigeon. But the animal was to be fully burnt before God. Let's read verses 8 and chapter 6, verse 8 and 9. So jump to chapter 6, verses 8 and 9.
Chapter 6, 8, and 9. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Command Aaron and his sons, saying, This is the law for the burnt offering.
That's what we were talking about, the burnt offering. So it's being mentioned here again.
The burnt offering itself shall remain on the hearth on the altar all night until the morning, and the fire on the altar is to be kept burning on.
So basically this whole entire sacrifice, this animal was to be burnt before God. And so it was a general atonement for sin, an expression of devotion to God. The grain offering. The grain offering was a voluntary expression of devotion, thanksgiving to God. It recognizes His goodness. It's giving praise to God. Generally, it was either a cooked bread or a seasoned, unsweetened, unleavened kind of bread that would have been offered to God. And I want to read chapter 2, verse 4 and verse 11. Leviticus 2, verse 4.
Now, when you bring an offering of the grain offering baked in the oven, it shall be unleavened cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, or unleavened wafers spread with oil.
Okay, then jump to verse 11.
No grain offering which you bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven, for you shall not offer up in smoke any leaven or any honey as an offering by fire to the Lord.
Often leaven is related to sin in Scripture. And like the little video said, we don't always know why God chooses to include things or not include, why some animals are clean and why they're unclean. We're not always told why, but it's to have no leaven and things in it. Part of this offering was burnt before the Lord, this bread, part of it was burnt, but part of this bread also was given to the priests. And so it would become his. He could eat it. It was his bread. So the person would bring this grain offering, and he would offer the entire grain offering to the Lord. Part of it was burnt on the altar, and part of it belonged to the priest, and he could take it home. Let's look at chapter 2, verse 16, and then we'll go back to verse 10. Chapter 2, verse 16.
The priest shall offer up in smoke its memorial portion, part of its grits and its oil with all its incense as an offering by fire to the Lord.
So that's the part that's burnt, given to God. And then back in verse 10, Peter.
The remainder of the grain offerings belong to Aaron and his sons, a thing most holy of the offerings to the Lord by fire.
So part of it belonged to Aaron, and part of it was burnt before God. But the grain offering was offering an expression of devotion, of thanksgiving, recognizing the goodness of God, how God has provided for you. Chapter 3 is the fellowship offering. Sometimes it's called a peace offering. And basically this was to be a meal between two different parties, or the idea of fellowship between two people, or fellowship between God and a particular person. Let's see. I didn't even have any verses on that. Chapter 4, it's the sin offering. Now, this is an offering for an unintentional sin. And we'll talk about what that is in a minute. But let's first read the verses. Chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, the sin offering.
Say to Israelites, when anyone sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden to any of the Lord's commandments, if the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt on his people, he must bring to the Lord a young bull without defect as a sin offering for the sins he has committed.
All right. So the question that I have to ask in this verse is an unintentional sin. What is an unintentional sin?
Accident?
Okay, an accident. I killed my neighbor, but I didn't mean to.
Three times.
3 times.
Say you shop groceries and you bring your stuff out to the car and you realize there's something in the car.
In the grocery bag.
In the cart that
Yeah.
you didn't pay for.
Okay.
And so you should go back in and say, this didn't go through the checkout.
Yeah. I tried looking this up, and so this is what I found. It's sins that are committed out of a weakness or a waywardness, as opposed to a sin that is committed with a raised fist in defiance to God. And so this unintentional sin, if that's the right definition, does not exclude me choosing to steal my neighbor's coffee, but it was at a time of weakness. I just hadn't had my morning coffee yet, and it was part of my weakness at the moment, and I yielded to the temptation I shouldn't have, as opposed to the kind of sin where I'm angry at God and I'm going to steal this cup of coffee in defiance to God and see if he's going to do anything about it. That kind of thing. So that's what I found. Look at Numbers chapter 15. It talks about a certain kind of sin. Numbers chapter 15 and verse 30. 30. Numbers 15, verse 30.
But the person who does anything defiantly, whether it is native or an alien, that one is blaspheming the Lord, and the person shall be cut off from among his people.
So what's the penalty for the kind of a sin that's in defiance and direct rebellion against God?
Cut off from the people.
And what's that mean in English?
Keep
Not
out of it,
having
yeah.
fellowship with others.
Maybe even, no fellowship, maybe even death. He is cut off from his people. Okay, so that's the sin offering. One more is the guilt offering. It's not the sense of guilt, and we think of guilt as being kind of that weight of sin, the guilt that we feel, but rather it refers to the matter of one's conscience, that that one owes something because of a sin that he's committed. Sometimes it's called a trespass offering. I like that. To me in English is more descriptive. He has trespassed a certain sin, and so it's a trespass or repatriation kind of sin. The purpose of this offering was to make atonement, to make to basically when I have chosen to disobey God, and how do I deal with that sin in my life? That's the debt that I owe. Let's look at chapter 5, verse 15 and 16. 15 and 16. Chapter 5, verse 15. Leviticus 5:15.
I've got it here. Oh, right here. When a person commits a violation and his sins unintentionally in regard to any of the Lord's holy things, he is to bring to the Lord as a penalty a ram from the flock, one without defect, and of any proper value in silver, according to the sanctification of
Shekel.
shekels. It is a guilt offering.
Mm-hmm.
He must, 16 to
Yes.
He must make restitution for what he had failed to do in regard to holy things. Add the fifth of the value to what was given to all to the priest, who will make atonement for him with the ram and as a guilt offering, and he will be forgiven.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So those are the offerings. There are 5 offerings. Chapter 6 and 7 basically add some different regulations concerning some of those offerings. Chapter 6-9, it goes back and talks about the burnt offerings. Verse 14, the grain offerings. Chapter 7, verse 11, the fellowship offerings. Chapter 6, verse 20. So it's just some added regulations that they're going to make concerning each one of those various offerings. Any questions on that? Comments? I want to go through the survey once more. That'll get us up and get us wiggling a little bit. And then Chris will get you to stretch there. We could do a Father Abraham. I saw you kind of, somehow when you went like this, reminded me of about 50 years ago in camp. Father Abraham. I don't know if you sang that song, but anyway. Creation, fall, flood, nation, 4,000 years, Persian Gulf, salt, Sarah, Abraham, Lot, Terah, Tigris, Euphrates, Haran, Teradais, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea, Mediterranean Sea, Israel, Ishmael, Isaac, Esau, Jacob, Joseph, Egypt, Jews, Egypt, 400 years, bondage, Moses, let my people go, no. 10 plagues, Red Sea, here's our new ones. Mount Sinai, what did they do at Mount Sinai? They received the law, the tabernacle, the Levites and priests. No, you don't need to do that. Offerings and feasts. Okay, thank you.
Well, let's talk about these priests. If you would, open up to Leviticus chapter 8. So if you think back to last week, we wrapped up last week in Exodus chapter 40. And in Exodus chapter 40, excuse me, the tabernacle had been erected according to God's plan as carried out by Moses. All of the items for the tabernacle had been put together, the altar of incense, the incense itself, the anointing oil, all those things, again, under the command of God. The clothing for the priests had been designed and put together and sewn up and made and out of the, woven out of fine material and things like that. So everything was in place. And even to the point where God had given Moses the commands on how to ordain the priests. We talked about that a little bit last week as well. So Exodus, that whole last section of Exodus takes us up to this point in Leviticus chapter 8, where now things are going to start to happen with respect to the priests. So open up to Leviticus 8. And Anne, I think we left off with you, if you would read verses 1 through 3.
Leviticus 8, 1 through 3. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take Aaron and his sons with him, and the garments, and the anointing oil, and the bowl of the sin offering, and the 2 rams, and the basket of unleavened bread, and assemble all the congregation at the doorway of the tent of meeting.
Okay, so here we have this ceremonial process that was commanded by God in Exodus 29, if you remember back to that, where the priests are going through this selection process and this anointing process. So it's Aaron and his 4 sons. Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar are the 4 sons that we're going to come across as we go through this. And they are to go in front of the doorway of the tent of meeting and assemble all the congregation, most likely probably just the elders, but it could have been the entire congregation as well. And we learn in verse 4 that Moses did just as the Lord commanded him. And when everyone was assembled, now this ceremony is going to begin. And it starts out with a washing. So Tim, if you would read 8 verses 5 through 6.
Moses said to the congregation, This is the thing which the Lord has commanded to do. Then Moses and Aaron and his sons came near and washed them with water.
Okay, so Moses, the first step in this, they're out in front of the tent of meeting, again, based on the commands from God. Moses takes them, and you remember the laver. The laver was one of those fixtures that was built for the tabernacle. So the water would have been coming from the laver, and there was a ceremonial washing that was taking place to and probably their entire body. Later on, the priests were only required to wash just their hands and feet. But in this particular instance, it was most likely the entire body to achieve a state of ceremonial cleanliness. It was the goal here in going through this process of washing. Following that, remember the clothing that was put together for the high priest. Now Moses is going to put that onto Aaron. And Peter, if you could read chapter 8, verses 7 through 9.
He put the tunic on him and girded him with the sash and clothed him with the robe and put the ephod on him. And he girded him with the artistic band of the ephod with which he tied it to him. He then placed the breastplate on him, and in the breastplate he put the Urim and the Thummim. He also placed the turban on his head, and on the turban at its front he placed the golden plate, the holy crown, just as the Lord had commanded Moses.
So now Moses goes through this process of dressing Aaron. If you remember the outfit, there's the picture that we had last week on the right. So he starts out with the tunic, and then he puts on the sash itself, puts on the robe, and puts the ephod on. Remember the ephod? What was on the shoulders of the ephod?
James to the tribes of Israel.
Right, and so the ephod had the stones. Remember there were 2 stones there, 6 tribes on each side, engraved on there. So the ephod was on there. So he puts that on there. The robe had you remember the bells? Remember the bells and the pomegranates on the robe? So as the priest was ministering inside the tabernacle, the people outside could hear the bells jingling and realize that God was showing his mercy by because the priest was still alive, there was an indication that God was being merciful towards the priest. So the ephod with the stones on the shoulders, then the breast piece, and what was on there? Somebody mentioned? The Urim and Thummim. Remember, there was some kind of a little pouch there where the Urim and the Thummim were kept. Urim means lights, Thummim means perfections. That was the way of divining God's will. We're not sure how that worked, but they were there nonetheless. And then also, too, you mentioned the 12 tribes, the 12 stones on the front of that breast piece that had the 12 tribes engraved on there over Aaron's heart. And then following that was the turban with the gold plate. It talks about the holy crown here. Does anybody remember what was inscribed on that? Wore it on the front of his head. Holy to the Lord. Remember that was inscribed on that plate so that when Aaron went into the tabernacle, that was always there on the front of his head, indicating that he was holy to the Lord. It's marking the wearer as one who is set apart, one who is set apart to the service of the Lord. So Moses has gotten Aaron all dressed up now, and there's another step involved here. Bob, if you could read chapter 8, verses 10 through 12.
Then Moses took the anointing oil and anointed the tabernacle and everything in it, and so consecrated it. He sprinkled some of the oil on the altars 7 times, anointing the altar and all its utensils and the basin with its stand to consecrate them. Then he poured some of the anointing oil on Aaron and anointed him to consecrate him.
Okay, so you remember the oil. The oil was that special mixture that God had commanded back in Exodus. And now that oil was considered to be holy. Remember, no one else was supposed to try to mix this oil on their own or anything like that. So now this holy oil that God has commanded has been sprinkled. So it's sprinkled onto the tabernacle itself and everything that was in it. So all of those implements that were used in the tabernacle with the goal of consecrating them. So Moses was consecrated, using the oil to consecrate the tabernacle and all that was in it. And then he also sprinkles some onto Aaron. And as a result, Aaron is consecrated too. We're setting him apart for service. To consecrate Aaron as well, this oil is used. This all had to be done before any other ceremonial sacrificial services could take place, because only holy people can perform these services in a holy place. And by going through this process of consecration, the tabernacle and all of its implements in there were made holy or consecrated, as well as Aaron himself was made consecrated too. So the preparation has been done. Now the ordination process goes on. Russell, if you could read Leviticus 8, verses 14 through 17.
Then he brought the bull of sin offering, and Aaron and his sons laid their hands on the head of the bull for the sin offering. Next Moses slaughtered and took the blood with his finger and put some of it around the horns of the altar and that purified the altar. Then he poured the rest of the blood on the base of the altar and consecrated it to make atonement for it. He also took the fat that was on the entrails and the lobe of the liver and the 2 kidneys and their fat, and Moses offered up in the smoke on the altar. But the bull and his hide and his flesh and his refuse he burned in the fire outside the camp, just as the Lord had commanded him.
So, even though they have gone through this ritual so far of consecrating Aaron with the oil and all the implements of the tabernacle, they're still not ready to perform the rituals that they're required to perform. So the offerings that are described in Exodus 29 still needed to be performed with Aaron and his sons. And the first one was this sin offering. Before he could intercede on behalf of others, the priest himself had to receive atonement. And that's what this sin offering is all about. They laid their hands on the bull to identify it and transfer to it their sin and their uncleanness. And then the bull was sacrificed. And you can see that part of it was offered up on the altar in smoke. But the bull and its hide, verse 17, and its flesh and its refuse burned in the fire outside of the camp because it was unclean. And the camp itself was ceremonially clean. And it had to be burned outside of the camp. So this first process here in preparing Aaron to do these rituals was to go through this sin offering. Then there's another offering that takes place as well. Marlene, if you could read chapter 8, verses 18 through 21.
He then presented the ram for the burnt offering, and Aaron and his sons laid their hands on its head. Then Moses slaughtered the ram and sprinkled the blood against the altar on all sides. He cut the ram into pieces and burnt the head and the pieces and the fat. He washed the inner parts and the legs with water and burnt the whole ram on the altar as a burnt offering, a pleasing aroma, and offering made to the Lord by fire, as the Lord had commanded Moses.
Okay, so the sin has been absolved by that first offering, the sin offering. Now this burnt offering is being presented too as a sign of dedication of their lives to God. So Aaron and his sons are offering up this offering, this burnt offering, as a sign of dedication of their lives to God, in service to God. There's one more that needs to be made as well. There's that second ram. Anne, if you could read Leviticus 8, 22 to 29.
Then he presented the second ram, the ram of ordination, and Aaron and his sons laid their hands on the head of the ram, and Moses slaughtered it, and took some of its blood, and put it on the lobe of Aaron's right ear, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. He also had Aaron's sons come near, and Moses put some of the blood on the lobe of their right ear, and on the thumb, on the thumb of their right hand, and on the big toe of their right foot. Moses then sprinkled the rest of the blood around on the altar. And he took the fat, and the fat tail, and all the fat that was on the entrails, and the lobe of the liver, and the 2 kidneys, and their fat, and the right thigh. And from the basket of unleavened bread that was before the Lord, he took 1 unleavened cake, and 1 cake of bread mixed with oil, and 1 wafer, and placed them on the portions of fat and on the right thigh. He then put all these on the hands of Aaron and on the hands of his sons, and presented them as a wave offering before the Lord. Then Moses took them from their hands and offered them up in smoke on the altar with the burnt offering. They were an ordination offering for a soothing aroma. It was an offering by fire to the Lord. Moses-
29 too.
Okay. Moses also took the breast and presented it for a wave offering before the Lord. It was Moses' portion of the ram of ordination, just as the Lord had commanded Moses.
Okay, so this last ram, or the second ram, was the ram for ordination. This is installing Aaron and his sons in their priestly offices. And like we talked last time, the blood was put on the right earlobe, the right thumb, and the right big toe. Does anybody remember why? What the thinking is on that?
So they would hear from the Lord, do the work of the Lord, and walk in.
Right. So the organs of hearing, doing, and walking are consecrated essentially in the service of the Lord by doing this, by going through this process. You know, the ram of ordination had a peculiar name. It's referred to as the ram of filling, because the Hebrew words for fill or fill a hand can also be used to mean to install the priest. And it really comes out in verses 25 through 27. Certain pieces of the ram were put onto 3 differently made pieces of bread. The one unleavened cake, the one cake of bread mixed with oil, and the one wafer. And then they were put into the hands of Aaron and his sons as a token of their priestly office. And then Moses slid his hands beneath theirs and moved those pieces back and forth in a solemn motion, as this is that wave offering in order to symbolize the dedication of the offering. So that wave offering was being done there. And by way of these gifts, the priests were in this manner offered to God. The priests themselves were being offered up to God, who God then gave back to Moses so that they could devote themselves to the service. That's kind of laid out in 25 through 27, that whole issue with the bread. And then in verse 29, the breast of that ordination offering was also treated as a wave offering, and part of it was given to Moses for his participation in the ordination ceremony of the priests. And in this way, the Lord is returning to Moses a portion of the ram that he was to eat. So there was a wave offering piece going on there as well. And then this was followed up in verse 30.
Is there any indication as to what the significance of those, in one sense it's kind of gory, as to what they represented, or
As far as the animals?
yeah, they're taking fat, tail, entrails, liver, kidneys.
The fat and the organs were considered to be the most valuable parts. So the most valuable parts were being offered up to God in that whole process of burning them up.
So fat is valuable? Is that what
Yeah, fat is good.
In the Philippines, that's the best piece of meat. That's about 2/3 fat and just a little sliver of meat in it.
Oh.
And that's the best piece there. For us, it's kind of, whoa. But
So they were offering the best portions for being set aside for God. In verse 30, there's a final consecration with oil. Moses took some of the anointing oil and some of the blood which was on the altar and sprinkled it on Aaron, on his garments, on his sons, and on the garments of his sons with him. And he consecrated Aaron, his garments, and his sons, and the garments of his sons with him. So there's the ceremony concludes with that second sprinkling, just to make sure that bond between God and the priest is as strong as possible. And then, this is all followed up. Verse 31. Tim, I think, did we leave off with you?
Yep. Then Moses said to Aaron and to his sons, boil the flesh at the doorway of the tent of meeting, and eat it there together with the bread, which is in the basket of the ordination offering, just as I commanded, saying, Aaron and his sons shall eat it.
And then jump down and read verse 33 too, if you would please.
You shall not go outside the doorway of the tent of the meeting for 7 days, until the day that the period of your ordination is fulfilled.
So Aaron and his sons were confined to the tabernacle for 7 days. This was a 7-day process to complete this ordination. There was this meal, it's mentioned in verse 31, to confirm this covenant that has been enacted between God in the house of Aaron. It's made up of the meat from the ordination ram and the bread that was mentioned in verse 26. And because the meat was from the ordination offering, it had a higher degree of holiness, had to be consumed within the sanctuary, with the remains being burned up. The offerings were to be, if you look at verse 34, the Lord is commanded to do as has been done this day, to make atonement on your behalf. And it's possible that this had to go on every day for this 7-day period. If you look at Exodus 29:35 quick. This is where the whole process is laid out by God. Exodus 29 verse 35, God says to Moses, "Thus you shall do to Aaron and to his sons according to all that I have commanded you. You shall ordain them through 7 days." So it's possible that they may have gone through this ceremony for this whole 7-day period. And they were to remain in the sanctuary for that 7-day period to avoid any possibility of defilement that by leaving the sanctuary itself, because that was the holy place. And then their ordination would be complete after this 7-day period. Now, chapter 9 of Leviticus, verse 1. Came about on the 8th day that Moses called Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel, and he said to Aaron, "Take for yourself a calf, a bull for a sin offering, and a ram for a burnt offering, both without defect, and offer them before the Lord." So after this 7-day period, this process is going to start again. And these are the offerings that are going to be given. So before Aaron and his sons, even though they've already done this, they have to do this again. That's one of the beautiful things about the book of Hebrews, where it says it's all been taken care of through Jesus Christ. This is an ongoing thing that has to take place. So essentially, Aaron and his sons need to go through this process again, at least a couple steps of it, in order to have the Lord appear to them. As it says in verse 4, they're going to go through this whole process, both the consecration of Aaron and his sons and of the people. In verse 4, it's because the Lord was going to appear to them. So, look at verse 2. Where do we leave off? Peter?
Verse 2 in chapter 9?
Yes.
And he said to Aaron, "Take for yourself a calf, a bull for a sin offering, and a ram for a burnt offering, both without defect, and offer them before the Lord."
Okay, so here's the sin offering. And then if you would jump down to verse, let's see, can you read 7 through 11? This is what happens to this sin offering.
Moses then said to Aaron, "Come near to the altar and offer your sin offering and your burnt offering, that you may make atonement for yourself and for the people. Then make the offering for the people, that you may make atonement for them, just as the Lord had commanded."
And then in verses 8 through 11, he goes through this whole process. So what's happening here is we're doing the sin offering for purposes of atonement, for purification and atonement of Aaron. And it says his people. Some commentators would say that it was Aaron's family only that's being dealt with here, but that was the sin offering, that offering of atonement that had to take place first. And then also in verse 2, it talks about a ram for a burnt offering. And Bob, if you could read 12 through 14, please.
Then he slaughtered the burnt offering. His sons handed him the blood, and he splashed it against the sides of the altar. They handed him the burnt offering piece by piece, including the head, and he burnt them on the altar. He washed the internal organs and the legs and burnt them on top of the burnt offerings on the altar. And he brought the offerings that was for the people. He took the goat for the people.
You can stop there. That's good. So Aaron offers up a sin offering and a burnt offering for himself and for, I guess, his family. What's missing from the previous process? You think back to the first 7 days, or even first day. Was there an additional offering that took place then?
The guilt offering.
The ordination offering. Remember the second ram? So here, the ordination has been completed. But now, Aaron still needs to offer this sin offering for his atonement. and he still needs to offer this burnt offering as a symbol or signifying that he is totally dedicated to God. That was the purpose behind that burnt offering as well. So God has instituted all these offerings so that the people would have access to him through atonement in spite of their sinfulness. But in order to do that, Aaron had to start the process first. He needed to take care of his own sin condition before he could minister on behalf of the people. Now in verse 3, Russell, if you could read chapter 9, verse 3.
Chapter 9, verse 3. Then to the sons of Israel you shall speak, saying, take a male goat for a sin offering, and a calf and a lamb, both 1-year-old without defect, for a burnt offering.
So now God commands the sons of Israel, he's working through Moses here, they are to take a male goat for a sin offering and a lamb for a burnt offering. So now Aaron is getting to the point where he can offer up the offerings for the people. He's taking care of his own sin condition and atonement. Now he's going to be offering the sin offering for the people, for atonement. In verse 15, it says, then he presented the people's offering and took the goat of the sin offering, which was for the people, and slaughtered it and offered it for sin, like the first. And then, Marlene, if you could read verse 16 of chapter 9.
He brought the burnt offering and offered it to in the prescribed way. He also brought a grain offering, taking a handful of the burnt on the altar, and in addition to the morning burnt offering.
Okay, so Aaron has now offered up the sin offering for the people for their atonement, and he's offered up the burnt offering for the people as well, to demonstrate their total dedication to God. There's one other offering that they're to give in verse 4 of chapter 9. So there's the ox and the ram. There's actually two more, actually. Ox and ram for peace offerings or fellowship offerings, and then a grain offering mixed with oil, for today the Lord will appear to you. So Aaron was to offer up the grain offering. If you look at verse 17, and if you could, I think, Marlene, you actually read that, but in verse 17, it said, next he presented the grain offering and filled his hand with some of it and offered it up in the smoke on the altar, besides the burnt offering of the morning. So the grain offering was given for the people too, as a sign of their dedication of their everyday life to God, in recognition of his covenant mercies that he's bestowed on them. Thankfulness. That grain offering was in recognition of being thankful to God for what he's done. And then also there was to be the peace offering, the ox and the ram from verse 4. There was to be this peace offering, this fellowship offering for the people, which was offered up in verse 18. Then he slaughtered the ox and the ram, the sacrifice of peace offerings, which was for the people. And Aaron's sons handed the blood to him, and he sprinkled it around on the altar. So these four offerings are now being given by Aaron on behalf of the people. Aaron had to go through the atonement and the burnt offering himself, which he did. But then once that was completed, then he went through these four offerings for the people, on behalf of the people. The sin offering, the burnt offering, the grain offering, and the peace or the fellowship offering. That's the process that God wanted them to do. And as a result, let's see, where did we leave off? If you could read 22 through 24, please.
Chapter 9, 22.
Right.
Then Aaron lifted up his hands toward the people and blessed them. And he stepped down after making the sin offering, and the burnt offering, and the peace offerings. And Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting. When they came out and blessed the people, the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Then fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the portions of fat on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces.
Wow, can you imagine what happened? Can you imagine seeing that take place? We've gone through this ritual. Here's God's response. We've received the blessing from Aaron and Moses, and fire comes out from before the Lord, consumes the burnt offering, the portions of fat, that really good stuff. and all the people see it, and their reaction is, whoa, and they fall down on their faces. Unbelievable. Everything is great, right? Almost. So, chapter 10. The same day. It certainly seems to be chronologically the same day that they had assumed their priestly office. Aaron's two sons, Nadab and Abihu, placed incense in a burning censer and brought it before the Lord. Tim, if you could read verses 1 through 3 of chapter 10.
Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting fire in them, placed incense on it, and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And the fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, "It is what the Lord spoke, saying, by those who come near me I will be treated as holy, and before all I will be honored." So Aaron therefore kept silent.
So, it appears that this event took place in the courtyard in front of the tent of meeting. We're not sure what their intention was. The Scripture doesn't give us any idea of what their intentions were. But apparently they were committing some kind of an arbitrary act that was contrary to what the Lord had commanded. And one thinking, it appears that apparently they must have attempted to present the daily offering of incense. If you jump back to Exodus 30, verses 7 through 9. Exodus 30, verses 7 through 9. God is speaking here. Aaron shall burn fragrant incense on it. He's talking about the altar of incense. He shall burn it every morning when he trims the lamps. When Aaron trims the lamps at twilight, he shall burn incense. There shall be perpetual incense before the Lord throughout your generations. You shall not offer any strange incense on this altar, or burnt offering or meal offering, and you shall not pour out a drink offering on it. So, we're not sure what's happened here, but apparently they were offering up this strange incense at a time when they weren't supposed to be doing it, and it's reserved. It's a task reserved for Aaron himself as the high priest. No one else was able to do it or allowed to do it other than him. Because of that fact, because of their timing and the fact that they were trying to do it, the fire in their censer was not authorized. And God does not appreciate arbitrary deeds in this ceremonial service that they have been very clearly instructed in how to do, least of all by those who have been called to follow the process to the letter. They've been given that responsibility, renounce their own will, follow just the will of God when it comes to this. So Nadab and Abihu have deviated from this, and as a result, their punishment follows instantly. Verse 2, and fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. If you go back to Leviticus chapter 9, verse 24, remember the fire came out from the burnt offering and consumed the burnt offering? What was that indicating to have that happen?
That sacrifice was accepted.
Yeah, God's favor, right? Now we have fire coming out, indicating what?
Anger.
Anger, God's wrath. So here's an expression of his wrath. Fire struck them down. Not a very happy day, but should have been a very happy day for Aaron, now turns into something that's pretty tragic. But what do we learn from this fact? What do we learn from this event that's taking place? God is holy. And those who are called to draw near to him and called to do his work and remain in the vicinity of this dwelling need to be what? They need to be careful. They are in a perilous position. I think it kind of talked about that in the video even, that they're in a perilous position, and this holiness of God can never be taken lightly. And apparently Nadab and Abihu were doing that. And any deed that does take the holiness of God lightly is going to be met with a manifestation of his holiness, right? Of his glory, which in this particular situation was fire coming out and consuming them, their annihilation.
Aren't you glad you weren't there?
Boy, that would put the fear into you, wouldn't it? That I am going to follow this process that God has ordained to the letter. and I'm going to submit my will to his will, because this is what he wants. This higher degree of office that they've been given places a higher responsibility on them. You know, and that's even talked about in the New Testament. Those, for example, who teach and preach have a higher accountability, a higher level of responsibility, and a higher level of accountability too.
First, don't you just see that God has kind of we've lost that? You know, to go before the Lord, it's such a high calling, and you have to be clean and cleansed, and you have to go with all your heart. But we kind of, yeah, you know, it's
The reverence isn't there anymore.
no.
Yep.
I think the Catholic, when I was young, the Catholic Church seemed to have reverence. When you went in there, you had to be quiet, or you got poked. Or, you know. Anyway.
You know, yeah, personal.
If there was anything
Yeah.
really good that I learned, it's the reverence of God.
We need to always bear that in mind, that God is the creator, the holy creator, and there is a degree of reverence that he is owed just because of that. So anyway, and Aaron understands this. If you look in verse 5, Moses explains to him this whole thing, that, hey, God is holy, and I will be treated as holy, and there's no other way. And Aaron understands that. His reaction is to keep silent. This is the strongest Hebrew term for being silent. It means absolutely no sound passed from his lips. He didn't sigh, he didn't go anything like that. There was nothing that came out of Aaron's lips as a result of that. So the bodies are removed, verses 4 and 5. We bring in the cousins of the two sons, because Eleazar and Ithamar, Aaron's other two sons, were not permitted to handle the bodies. And so the cousins, Mishael and Elzaphan, the sons of Aaron's uncle, were brought in to carry the bodies out. They came forward, they carried them still in their tunics. Notice that. How even though they were burned up, the tunics were not. I think that's an interesting thing there. They were still in their tunics, and they were carried outside the camp. And they are commanded not to mourn. Verses 6 and 7. Peter, if you could read those, please.
And Moses said to Aaron and to his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, do not uncover your heads nor tear your clothes, so that you will not die, and that he will not become wrathful against all the congregation. But your kinsmen, the whole house of Israel, shall bewail the burning with which the Lord has brought about. You shall not even go out from the doorway of the tent of meeting, or you will die. For the Lord's anointing oil is upon you. So they did according to the word of Moses.
So again, they couldn't leave the tabernacle because they would be defiled by doing so. The Lord's anointing oil was upon them, and they were not even permitted to mourn. The people were permitted to mourn for Nadab and Abihu, but Aaron and his other two sons were not. One explanation that I saw was the life-giving power of the oil could not have even the least bit of contact with death and with the realm of death. And by mourning, that would be taking place. Aaron does get some reassurance from the Lord. Verse 8, the Lord then spoke to Aaron. He's speaking to Aaron directly. This is the only time in the book of Leviticus that God speaks directly to Aaron without any mediation from Moses. But he does give him instructions regarding strong drink. Don't drink any strong drink or wine. Basically because, number one, you need to keep a clear head as a priest. And also in that day, the pagan religions often used strong drink as a way to try to reach out to the invisible world, the spiritual world. And God's priests were not allowed to do that. They were to rely on the presence of God at the tabernacle. And the priests needed clear heads, though, too, in order to make sure that they could help the people, in verse 10, to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, and between the clean, the unclean and the clean. and so as to teach the sons of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them through Moses. So that was their responsibility, and because of that responsibility, that high calling that they had, they needed to keep a clear head. And you'll notice in verse 8, or verse 9 rather, that was a perpetual statute throughout their generations, that the priests were not to drink strong drink or wine. So, continuing on, verse 12, there's a disposition of some of these sacrificial portions. Moses now specifies who's permitted to eat the priestly portions of the offering presented on behalf of the people, and where this was to take place. The most holy portions were to be eaten in the courtyard by the priests only. Verse 13. Verse 12, take the grain offering that is left over from the Lord's offerings by fire and eat it unleavened beside the altar, for it is most holy. You shall eat it moreover in a holy place, because it is your due and your son's due out of the Lord's offerings by fire, for thus I have been commanded. But the breast of the wave offering, however, and the thigh of the offering you may eat in a clean place. In other words, it didn't have to be eaten in the tabernacle. You and your sons and your daughters with you, for they have been given as your due and your sons' due out of the sacrifices of the peace offerings of the sons of Israel. So that could be eaten. The camp was considered clean. That's why someone who had a skin disease was put out of the camp. But the camp itself, this fellowship offering piece, was not the most holy one. It could be eaten by the family members. And then we get just a brief historical little episode here. Moses searched carefully for the goat of the sin offering, and behold, it had been burned up. It wasn't supposed to be burned up. So he was angry with Aaron's surviving sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, saying, why did you not eat the sin offering at the holy place? That's what it was supposed to happen to it, but it didn't take place that way. They had instead burned it up. Aaron, look at verse 18. Actually, verse 19. But Aaron spoke to Moses. So Moses is upset, and Aaron gets it. Aaron understands why. But he speaks to Moses in verse 19. Behold, this very day they presented their sin offering and their burnt offering before the Lord. When things like these happened to me, if I had eaten a sin offering today, would it have been good in the sight of the Lord? So Aaron acknowledges the mistakes of his sons. But he also excuses them by saying, based on what's happened here, to the other sons especially, he asks Moses a question. He questions whether or not Moses was completely sure that that Aaron and his sons were permitted to eat the meat of the sin offering on a day when the Lord's wrath had been revealed. And Moses, out of his own knowledge and wisdom, didn't really give an answer to this question. So he gives no answer. Verse 20, he withdraws his reproach of Aaron. The whole key here being the holiness of God. That's the theme of Leviticus. And the fact that these priests are set apart in order to minister for the people on their behalf to God and to minister in the presence of God, there are some standards that they have to meet. And those standards are laid out. They have to go through that consecration ordination process, which Aaron and his sons did. Once they've done that, they've been ordained. They too, before they can offer the sacrifices on behalf of the people, they need to make sure that their own sins are covered over through that atonement offering and through that burnt offering. And then they can go forward and offer the offerings for the people. But it has to be done the way God commands it. And the episode with Nadab and Abihu demonstrates that fact, that God doesn't appreciate arbitrary steps taken. And he will demonstrate his holiness. He will not suffer anyone who compromises the holiness of God.